It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 1, printed in Part B of House Report 11616. What purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-16, offered by Mr. Swazi of New York.
Pursuant to House Resolution 172, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Swazi, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Chairman, before I speak about our bipartisan amendment, I'd like to thank Representatives Sarbanes and Representative Lofgren for their hard work on H.R. 1. I'd also like to commend Chairman McGovern and his staff on the Rules Committee and the entire Rules Committee for making our amendment in order and for working with the Problem Solvers Caucus and other pragmatic members to foster an inclusive process. Our bipartisan amendment, number 112 to H.R. 1, with 24 Democrats and 20 Republican co-sponsors, would require the Federal Elections Commission to conduct an audit after each federal election cycle to determine any incidents of illicit foreign money in the election. The reason we have such a bipartisan supported amendment is because of the hard work of the Problem Solvers Caucus, chaired by my friends Chairman Reed for the Republicans and Chairman Gottheimer from the Democrats. In January, our colleagues on the Problem Solvers Caucus worked with the leadership to negotiate the 2020 rule as part of our Break the Gridlock proposal. This amendment is the first amendment to receive preferential treatment under the 2020 rule by the Rules Committee, and we're happy to see our addition to the rules package has worked its way to encourage transparency and bipartisanship in the 116th Congress. Mr. Chairman, campaign finance law has loopholes, leaving the American electoral process susceptible to illicit funding from foreign nationals, corporations, and government. Foreign money easily influences our elections by passing funds through shell corporations, U.S. subsidiaries, investments, trade associations, and shell corporations. Under our proposed amendment, within 180 days of an election, the FEC will submit to Congress a report containing audit results and recommendations to address the presence of illicit foreign money. I urge the members of this Congress to continue to utilize the 2020 rule and gain some muscle memory of working in a bipartisan way to work for the American people. Confidence in our electoral process is essential to faith in our government institutions, and I urge the passage of this bipartisan amendment to H.R. 1. I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. For what reason does the gentleman from New York, the other gentleman from New York, rise?
To seek the Republican response time, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to start by thanking my colleague, Mr. Swazi from New York, as well as our Republican colleague, Mr. Fitzpatrick, who led the charge on this amendment process and this amendment before you, Mr. Chairman. I would also take a moment to thank my co-chair on the Problem Solvers Caucus, Mr. Gottheimer from New Jersey. Though we may disagree on the fundamental bill before us, Mr. Chairman, I am pleased to be able to report to the American people today that there are still members here that are looking to find common ground. And in the amendment before you that has been put forward in this new mechanism in the Rules Committee to encourage bipartisan debate, we have found that common ground in regards to the transparency and the requirements that this amendment calls for in regards to making sure that if foreign money is in our election process, that we do what we can in order to root that out and bring sunshine to that issue for all Americans to see. I encourage my colleagues on our side of the aisle to support this amendment, because this is that common ground that, even though we may fundamentally disagree on some of the final conclusions of H.R. 1 and the issue and the debate that we've already seen on display here today, this is something that common sense dictates, that we come together as Democrats and Republicans, working together to find that common ground to advance the American cause. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield a minute and a half to the gentlelady from Virginia, Abigail Spanberger.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of this amendment to H.R. 1. I speak today as someone who has spent my career in public service identifying foreign threats to the safety and security of the American people. As a former CIA officer, I work to identify threats to our country, our fellow Americans, and threats that would leave our nation vulnerable to attack, espionage, or foreign influence. As Congress acts this week to restore transparency to our government and regain trust from the people we serve, we must take steps to prevent foreign influence in our democratic process. I support efforts to push back against the very real threat of foreign financial influence. I know nefarious actors are out there. I know they are tireless in their commitment to target our foundational institutions, including our voting process. The American people shouldn't have to worry about the ability of foreign governments or entities to influence our elections and our citizens, but senseless loopholes in our campaign finance system have left our electoral process vulnerable to spending by foreign governments, corporations, and foreign nationals. These foreign entities should not have the ability to exert influence over the issues that impact Americans most, including the national defense, healthcare, and our financial services sector. That's why I am proud to co-sponsor this much-needed bipartisan amendment. This amendment would strengthen the integrity of our elections by encouraging our government to ensure that our campaign finance system is not falling prey to signs of foreign money in our politics. It would require the FEC to conduct an audit and to look for foreign money in our elections, and then require the FEC to report its findings. I yield back my time.
Thank you, gentlewoman. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from New York on the other side of the aisle is recognized.
At this point in time, in the spirit of bipartisanship and in the effort to find common ground, I'm going to yield a minute and a half of our time to my good friend from New Jersey, Democratic co-chair of the Problem Solvers Caucus, Josh Gottheimer.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to my co-chair of the Problem Solvers Caucus, Tom Reed. Thank you for your leadership as well. Thank you for allowing me to speak on behalf of this important bipartisan amendment to H.R. 1. I also want to thank Congressman Lofgren and Congressman Sarbanes for their leadership on this legislation, and to my colleagues who offered this amendment, my very good friend Congressman Suozzi and Congressman Fitzpatrick. Thank you for your work on this bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus initiative, which I know will further help improve H.R. 1 by stopping the flow of foreign money and helping into our elections. This amendment was developed with strong support from the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus, utilizing the new Break the Gridlock rules reforms that the caucus helped put in place in the new Congress. This is the first time the 2020 rule is being utilized for broad bipartisan support legislation, and an amendment like this sends exactly the right signal to the American people that we can work together to move legislation. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of H.R. 1, the For the People Act, which will help strengthen voting rights in our country, help clean corruption out of our politics, and protect free and fair elections, which is the bedrock of our democracy. Civil rights means that everyone in our great nation has equal rights and therefore equal speech. Dark money in our politics flies in the face of that American ideal wherever it comes from. Even worse is dark foreign money. Loopholes in our campaign finance system have left our electoral process vulnerable to unlimited spending by foreign governments, corporations, and foreign nationals in our elections. We've seen that foreign entities are able to spend undisclosed amounts of money to influence U.S. elections by using subsidiaries, shell corporations, or advocacy groups to hide their influence. In 2016, the American Pacific International Capital, a company owned by the Chinese nationals, used these loopholes to donate $1.3 million to a super PAC in the presidential election. Even in the most recent election, Thank you. Even in this most recent election, 2018, Iran, China, and Russia all attempted to influence American voters and policy. Americans on both sides of the aisle agree this is a critically important issue that we must do something about. The adoption of this amendment will further codify the intent of Congress to end unchecked foreign spending, which is the scourge of our democracy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time, and I look forward to more support for 2020 legislative amendments.
I reserve.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I'm going to reserve to close. And
we have no other speakers here, so we're prepared to close.
Okay.
Gentleman from New York, upstate New York, is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, as we wrap up the debate on this amendment, I hope we've demonstrated that there is common ground to be found in this chamber. And I would like to take a moment to thank, again, my colleagues, but also the Rules Committee, Mr. McGovern and his staff, for working with us in regards to this new reform of the rules process that will reward and encourage bipartisan behavior and bipartisan common ground finding efforts. And I encourage all members on both sides of the aisle, utilize this new rule path to bring forth ideas that benefit the American people in a bipartisan way. And at the end of the day, this amendment is something we should all support for the reasons articulated by my colleagues on the other side and as articulated hopefully by myself today in regards to supporting this reform that goes at the issue of foreign money in our elections. And with that, I encourage our members to support this amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from downstate New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to applaud my co-lead on this bill, this bipartisan bill, Congressman Fitzpatrick, a Republican from Pennsylvania who couldn't be here today. But he worked very hard on this, as did the other colleagues that have spoken here already. The people of America are hungering for bipartisanship. They're hungering for people to work together to try and solve the problems in this country. And we hope that the use of the 2020 rule and this amendment with 24 Democrats and 20 Republicans is one small step in that process to demonstrate that people can work together to solve problems. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The question on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York.